Over 6 months ago, I discussed about the lost media relating to Super Mario, but another franchise that can also compete with the immense amounts of lost media within its own franchise is none other than the plumber's rival, Sonic, who has been having a lot of his own lost media throughout his 30-year run. So my name is Lev, and let's look at the lost media of Sonic the Hedgehog. When you look throughout the Sonic franchise, one particular era stands out in comparison to the rest, that being the Sega Saturn era. This was a time where all the Sonic games we got only consisted of spin-offs and game collections. Don't get me wrong, there definitely were attempts to give us a full-fledged 3D Sonic game, but all of those failed, with two of the most infamous ones being that of Sonic X-treme and Sonic Saturn. And while Sonic X-treme is definitely an interesting project within its own right, that's a topic for a different video. So we're instead gonna be talking about the much more elusive Sonic Saturn. Sonic Saturn took the form of a prototype that was developed throughout 1995 to 1996 by Sega Technical Institute, alongside the development of Sonic X-treme. But unlike Sonic X-treme, Sonic Saturn was going to be a way different game, not only for the fact that it used a 3D model in comparison to a sprite, but also for the fact that it also used a much more different engine that would have created a much more realistic experience in comparison to Sonic X-treme. Aside from this, also includes some concept art of an unused Badnik, but we still don't know what role he would have played in the game besides being a potential enemy. The game would eventually meet its end when both Peter and Adrian, the two creators of Sonic Saturn, pitched the game's engine to Yuji Naka, who proceeded to reject the game immediately. After the game's rejection, there were still plans to reuse the engine for the game for a pinball minigame in Sonic 3D Blast for the Sega Saturn, but it's due to time constraints that has never appeared in the game. Despite this, there are still some screenshots available of this once playable mode, with even one of the settings being reused in Sonic R. In the end of the day, Sonic Saturn is another glimpse of what the Sonic franchise could have looked like if he had a platformer on the Sega Saturn. And maybe in a different timeline where Yuji Naka accepted his prototype, we could have lived in that reality. Sonic 06. Is there really anything else I need to say about this game? It is without doubt one of the most infamous Sonic games of all time, if not one of the most infamous games of all time. But wouldn't you believe that this game could have had a sequel released if the game had better reception? The first ever evidence for this game would come from Pete Capella's portfolio page, who was the voice actor for Silver throughout the late 2000s. And on this page, you can see a direct mention of Sonic Awakening. This single piece of evidence would start multiple years of speculation for this game's existence, due to the fact that the only piece of information regarding the game was through one single mention from long ago. At first, people thought the game could have potentially been a sequel to Sonic 06, but more in particular, a spin-off starring Silver the Hedgehog due to Pete Capella voice acting the character. But all of this was simply just rumor, and there were still people out there who thought this was simply fake. And I gotta be honest with you, I was definitely on that boat. Because how the heck can a game that's supposedly gonna be a sequel to Sonic 06 have no evidence out there besides a single mention? Surprisingly, even more than I expected, because on a lost media forum discussing Sonic Awakening, A user, known as Leave It to Lammy, was able to talk to the former voice actor of Amy.
Rambly backstory: a few months ago I was staffed at a convention, Syracuse Collectors Con. I had the absolute honor to work with Lisa Ortiz, Amy's 4 Kids VA. During that time, I took the opportunity to ask about Sonic Awakening. She told me she vaguely remembered it, and after I explained what we knew, she said she would try and ask Jason Griffith and Pete Capella. Apparently, the Hedgehog's Vass are all still friends and talk regularly. Unfortunately, she came up with nothing. None of the Hedgehogs had any materials related to the game or any real recollection, beyond that they worked on it. All could recall was that it was supposed to be the next big Sonic game. I didn't record the conversation, but as some form of proof I have included a couple photos I took from the event and an autograph I got from her.
Alongside this information also came Pete Capella once again, who despite not having that much information regarding the game's existence, still discussed how the game never happened, which still lines up with the information we heard previously about Amy's voice actor. It still isn't confirmed that this game is in existence just yet, and from what we know, it could be a different title for a Sonic game that did release, like Sonic Unleashed for example. But at least with this information, we have a better clue of where to go with this search. And maybe if we discuss this to other voice actors, we could potentially learn more about the game's existence. But until that happens, Sonic Awakening will be a rumor unless it's proved otherwise. Considered to be the black sheep of the Sonic franchise, Shadow the Hedgehog is a well-known title for many reasons, but mostly for its much more mature nature in comparison to the rest of the franchise for its profanity and gun use. But originally, the game was supposed to be much more violent than what we ended up getting for the original teen version of the game. Differences that can be seen in the earlier builds of this version consist of blood coming out of the gun soldiers, more use of profanity such as Sonic saying piss, and a full uncut version of Maria's death scene. Many of these differences can be seen throughout footage of the early version of the game, and when the original game was first sent to the ESRB, it was granted a rated teen rating. But this all changed when the ESRB in the exact same year introduced the E10 Plus rating. And Sega, thinking that it would be better to have this game reach its target audience, decided to cleanse many of the more mature elements of the game to give it the E10 Plus rating. And while there was some rumors stating that many of these changes can still be seen in the Japanese version of the game, those rumors are simply false. And as we speak, the teen version of Shadow the Hedgehog still remains as a lost build. Throughout the 90s, Sonic was everywhere. Not only throughout pop culture, but of course through Sega themselves, with pretty much every single Sonic spin-off being thrown across consoles, handhelds, and even beyond that. But with a franchise that is so popular, it makes sense there'll be some attempts to put that franchise in places you wouldn't expect. And one area where that almost got seen due to the localization of a completely different game. This brings us to Sister Sonic, which is supposed to be a version of Pop for Mail for the Sega CD, that was first announced through Beep Beep Mega Drive in the November 1992 issue. The game would have focused on Sonic's female relative, Sister Sonic, who is described to be a bounty hunter, and much more sexier and flirtatious in comparison to Sonic. The game would have also replaced all the other cast members with different Sonic characters, with the main plan being to focus on reimagining many of the hit titles for a much more international appeal. These statements will lead to a large numbers of angry letters reaching Sega, with it eventually being decided to cancel this reimagining of Powerful Mail in favor of simply localizing the game. When you're looking at Sonic continuities, there are plenty of versions of Sonic you can look at, ranging from game, comic, or TV show. But one of the most infamous of these Sonic versions is the one that came from Sonic Boom, which only lasted for a single decade within the 2010s, but without doubt left the biggest impact on the Sonic franchise, mostly for the worst. But what people tend to forget is the much more bigger picture that came during this game's development, and how in some senses, the Sonic Boom we were once promised ended up becoming lost during its development. This brings us to Sonic Synergy, the original version of Sonic Boom that was made by Big Red Button, a team consisting of ex-Naughty Dog employees, and was made when Sega offered the ability for a Western developer to take the Sonic franchise and make their own continuity out of it. The story would have focused on Sonic and Eggman and how they were once friends before eventually becoming enemies due to some timeline shenanigans, while also unleashing the main villain of the game, Lyric. Sonic Synergy would have focused more on exploration, combat, and 4-player co-op, which would have been done through Enerbeams, which would be used in puzzles, vehicles, which would also be a focus, alongside many other things within this more grittier world, which isn't even counting everything this game has to offer, such as the varied weapons, and even the different puzzles with the pre-existing abilities. But if we had discussed that, we would be here all day. So in short, this game looked like it was a very promising one. Or at least it was promising until some tomfoolery was happening in the background. It was happening from none other than Sega themselves. The first blow came with Sega teaming up with a French animation studio known as Redo to make a Sonic series based on the game, which forced Big Red Button into making the story less serious to accommodate for the cartoon. But the bigger blow that would doom this project was Sega's free game exclusive deal with Nintendo, which consisted of Sonic Lost World, Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, and Sonic Synergy, which forced the team into making this game that was envisioned to mostly run on the PC to now work on the Wii U, with the engine, that being CryEngine 3, never having a single game ported to a Wii U at that point in time. And to put the final nail into the coffin for this already doomed project was the fact that Sega had a deadline, November of 2014, which would coincide with the comics, action figures, plushies, and 3DS game. This pretty much forced the developers into rushing the game to meet this deadline, which also resulted in many of the ex-staff of the team leaving the studio. And by the time the game was reaching closer and closer to its deadline, the more and more issues showed up due to the Wii U's hardware. And I think we all know how the story went from there. In the end of the day, Sonic Synergy is another example of how a company can ruin a vision for what you're making. And it's so sad to see such a promising project end up becoming shit due to the circumstances Big Red Button were put into. In the list of Sonic lost media, this probably remains as the most infamous to Sonic history as a whole. This is the Tokyo Toy Show build of Sonic 1. This was the first ever time Sonic was shown off to the public, and through a Tokyo Toy Show at that, which was pretty much the only way to show off the demo due to the fact there weren't any game conventions at the time of the game's development. And just by looking at the screenshots can give us a huge idea of the differences between this and the final release. The background, for example, which would have been made up of a mountain landscape, was supposed to have 7 layers of parallax scrolling, with the trees and rocks in the background being independent from the clouds and other objects within the level. Besides the background differences, we can also see other more smaller differences, such as this enemy right over here, which despite not appearing in the final game, can still be seen in one of the concept art during Sonic 1's development. Or how about this sign, which despite being somewhat obscured by Sonic, is confirmed by Yuji Naka to be saying, "You are welcome, never seen." And we also cannot forget about Sonic, who has a much more different sprite in comparison to his final release, such as a different tint of blue, much more bigger eyes, and a different walk cycle in comparison to his final version. And to round everything out, we have his Japanese message in the background that translates to "debut approaching," which is most likely used when the demo was over. And this is scratching the surface of all the other changes this prototype build could have had, which brings up the question of where it still is and why it's still lost. And unlike some other companies, it isn't because they're keeping it inside the vault, but instead because the company that made this demo actually lost it, which happened all the way back during the development of Sonic Mega Collection, with Sega planning on using the Tokyo Toy Show prototype as a bonus feature within the game, only for Sega to realize that they don't have the prototype within their archives, which has become the case ever since that fateful day, with the only new information regarding the prototype coming from interviews and a few additional screenshots from magazines. And while it's possible that the prototype may get released one day, there's also a chance that it will remain lost forever, which is a sad truth about such an important part of Sonic history. A history that is not only defined by the games that released, but also the games that didn't.